I couldn't believe I had done this thing that I said I would never do. And I did. For a split second, for that brief moment, I was just so stunned that it had happened. And then just instantly, like a flood, those emotions started just overwhelmed me. Those emotions of feeling ashamed and guilty, and how could God ever forgive me? And why would God love me? And why would God ever give me a second chance? I felt I felt that darkness again. And unfortunately, I allowed those emotions to cloud my judgment and my healing experience for a brief amount of time.
Hi, everybody. It's Pastor Tom of the 24 Today podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. So, let me ask you, when is the last time you had a fail in your life? Something that was really embarrassing, something that you just can't believe that you did. You are going to identify with my guest today, and this is going to be so helpful for you because all of us have failed. All of us know what it's like to be embarrassed. All of us know what it's like to have a goal for us, and then we just don't meet it. And the questions are, how do we recover from that? And does God forgive for those certain things? Is there life? Is there hope again? All right, my guest today is Brittany Rust, and I want to thank her so much for being with me on the podcast. Thanks, Brittany, for being here.
Thank you for having me, Tom. It's such an honor.
Brittany has written a book called Untouchable, which I have. I actually have it. I'm an Audible listener, so I have it in Audible form, and I love it. Brittany is a great writer, and I want to encourage you to get that book. Brittany has been a pastor. She still, of course, is very active in ministry. She is an author. She's a speaker. She's a wife. She's a mom. She writes for all kinds of things, which is one of the first ways that I actually found you. She writes for crosswalk.com. She writes for Propel Women YouVersion, which is like my favorite app in the world, and I look at it and listen to it every day. She writes for Focus on the Family. She has a website called BrittanyRust.com. BrittanyRust.com. Encouragement for the world-weary believer. Thanks again, Brittany. Tell us a little bit about yourself, if you will, Brittany.
Sure. Well, I didn't grow up in a Christian home,
Uh-huh.
but when I was 16, someone brought me to church and I gave my heart to the Lord. And just ever since then, have just been so committed to serving Him, building the kingdom. I've been in ministry since I graduated high school. I was serving in the church. I've served for faith nonprofits. I was a pastor. And right now, I'm actually at home with my little one and focusing on the writing and a book and the podcast that God is allowing me to do. But I have a husband named Ryan, and he serves at a nonprofit. And then we have a little boy named Roman, who's 1.5, and a little one in heaven.
Okay. And let me ask you, just totally random question, what was your favorite TV show growing up?
Oh, the 90s are gold for
Okay.
sitcoms. So that's a hard one, but I think I'd have to say Saved by the Bell. I think that was every little girl's favorite show in the 90s. I wanted to be Kelly Kapowski, so that was a fun one for me. And I
Yep.
still watch it to this
Yeah,
day
you
if it's
still
on
watch
TV.
reruns?
Yeah.
So, Brittany, let's jump right into your story if we can. And your story is, as I've mentioned, it's deeply personal, and there are things that I just have so much appreciation for you and your honesty, your willingness to be honest, and just to tell people about what happened to you, because you want people to be able to grow from your own experiences, and you want to let people know that there is hope, and maybe that we don't have to make some of the same mistakes that you did. But your story starts really when you were a young child, and you talk about an experience in your book, which you say something happened that was kind of the root thing for all that for so much of what you've struggled with in life. Something happened. Can you tell us about that when you were a child?
Sure. So when I was a kid, I was sexually abused. I was around 4 or 5. And while for many that would cause them to want to flee from anything sexual, for me, it had the
Hmm.
opposite effect. And going into junior high and high school, I developed an addiction to masturbation and pornography. And so, really at a young age, developed this addiction to things of the sexual nature. And it was something that, I carried into my teens
Hmm.
and carried into my salvation. And thankfully, the Lord, worked, but it was a stronghold for me for many years, even after I thought God had delivered me. As we'll learn, it still popped up and still was a struggle for me.
Mm. So when you say salvation, you're talking about that point in which you realize um, there was a God and you need God in your life, and you ask God for forgiveness and ask Him to come into your
Mm-hmm.
heart, and you're saying that you you still were struggling even after that. So that doesn't
Mm-hmm.
just magically make everything that we struggle with go away.
Yeah, I think a lot of people think that when they become a Christian, those strongholds from their past will
Right.
magically disappear.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the case, but
Yeah.
oftentimes it's not. And you still
Right.
have to work through healing and redemption and then finding freedom from those strongholds even after you become a Christian. And that
Sure.
was the case for me.
Mm.
Hmm.
Now you have some really powerful words in your book. The whole book's powerful, but talking about your growing up years,
Hmm.
you described that you felt alone, lost, and like there was some kind of a dark weight
Hmm.
upon. Those are really powerful, descriptive words and tough words for a young child to be experiencing. Alone,
Hmm.
lost, dark weight. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so like I said, I didn't grow up in a Christian home. In fact, there wasn't really even mention of God or Jesus. And on top of that, our family had a lot of anger issues. And so I grew up in this atmosphere that was always very angry. Nobody really talked about what was going on or about what they were feeling. And I just felt like I was always walking on eggshells. And so not only did I develop this, stronghold with the things, the sexual nature, but I developed an anger stronghold in
Mm.
my life. And when I was in high school, that, I felt so alone. I felt so much shame for even struggling with masturbation and pornography.
Mm-hmm.
And I kept all of that hidden. And so I felt so heavy, so alone. And then when I was 16, I almost had an ulcer. I woke up in so much pain. My parents took me to the doctor. I was forming an ulcer. I was just so stressed. And they said I was depressed and they put me on medications.
Mm-hmm.
And I really just hit an all time low where I was self medicating and I was, struggling with these strongholds alone. And
Mm-hmm.
I just felt so hopeless. But at the same time, I knew, gosh, there's got to be more to life than
Yeah.
this. There has to be. This can't be it. And so I was just so open to something better, something
Mm.
tangible, something real. And I ended up finding that
Mm-hmm.
when I was 16 years old
Sure.
when I went to church, and a
Okay.
friend invited me to a youth service, and I heard the gospel that night. And I
Mm.
knew for the first time in my life, I was hearing truth. I was hearing what I'd always been longing for, and that was the gospel.
Okay, so gospel means good news.
Hmm.
What was the good news that you were hearing in that message?
It was, and I still think about this today, that God would see a broken, depressed 16-year-old girl struggling with these horrible, dark strongholds, that He would see that girl and still love her and still offer grace and redemption to her. I just couldn't believe that there was that kind of love and that kind of gift of mercy available to me. And so, um, I just could not help but fall completely in love with Jesus when
Mm.
I heard that He loved me and saw me.
Was there anything close up to that point in your life where you felt such acceptance? And again, another Bible term is we use grace,
Hmm.
which means that God is willing to forgive us wherever we're at, whatever we're doing or have done. I mean,
Hmm.
He just is willing to reach out His arms and love us. Had you ever felt anything that close or that powerful in your life?
No. And I think that's why I felt so hopeless. And I just thought, man, is this really all that there is? because I hadn't felt that. And that's why when I did experience his grace and his mercy that night, it was just so overwhelming, and it was so powerful, but it was so real. It was so real.
Shame, you mentioned earlier, shame is
Mm-hmm.
such a difficult burden. I mean, we all have felt
Mm-hmm.
shame, and you
Mm-hmm.
felt added shame, I'm sure,
Mm-hmm.
because again, it's pornography, and men who struggle with pornography feel shame,
Mm-hmm.
but yet I know that it's got to be even more shame that you feel as a woman for that kind of a struggle.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly, because there was this mindset that this isn't a woman's struggle. I
Yeah.
shouldn't be struggling with this.
Mm.
And so I didn't think that there was anyone I could talk to, because I didn't feel like there would be anyone who could understand my struggle. I felt so guilty and ashamed for even struggling with these issues. And I certainly felt alone in that.
And that really is what we all, part of all what we go through in our shame is that we are the worst,
Mm.
if not the only one. I mean, we're like the
Mm-hmm.
only one who has struggled with this, or has gone this far, or has done this level of embarrassing things,
Mm-hmm.
and that creates such a sense of being alone. And what you were feeling alone,
Mm-hmm.
lost, and like there was this dark weight on you
Mm-hmm.
that could not be relieved. And so you go to this youth service,
Mm-hmm.
and somebody is talking to you about God,
Mm-hmm.
and that there's a God who actually loves you, will forgive you, who will accept you as you are,
Mm-hmm.
and then will help you with your stuff.
Yeah.
Wow,
Yeah.
how encouraging.
Yeah, it was a powerful night. I can remember everything about that experience. And I have the
Hmm.
worst memory. So,
Yeah,
I mean, the fact that I can remember where I was sitting and what the lights were like. I mean, that's just
yeah.
how powerful that moment was, because instantly God changed my life.
Hmm. So you become, as we would put it, a Christian, a follower of
Mhm.
Christ. You're starting to pray, right? You're
Mhm.
starting to read the Bible. Those
Mhm.
things. You're starting to go to church now. Um, Perhaps you're developing some Christian friends that maybe
Yes.
you didn't have, that have
Mhm.
similar thoughts. So now your conversations are different.
Mhm.
Maybe some of the music you're listening to is different. Just you start to get in a whole different world, in a
Yeah.
whole different frame of mind,
Mhm.
and along with that, you start to get some leadership roles
Mhm.
in church, where you're
Mhm.
actually able to work as a leader in a church and help other people. So
Mhm.
here this person who has struggled for all these years with shame and guilt, and who isn't totally free of everything, which, by the way, listeners, like, you never you never get over everything and are just perfect, and that you never have sins in your life. And there's always, as I say, there's always bullies who threaten to take away our lunch money. There's always a bully
Mhm.
or two or three in our life, and many of them are things that we've struggled with for forever. So you
Mhm.
still had those bullies in your life. You're a leader.
Mhm.
What kind of things were you doing as a leader? What were you doing now in leadership?
So when I went out of high school, they had a 9-month discipleship program. So I went into the discipleship program, and that's where they taught me how to pray and how to read the Bible and memorize scripture and fast and to serve. It was this incubator of just such transformation that was pulling out all the old Brittany and really incorporating those things into me that were healthy and that were biblical. And it was actually during that program that I felt a freedom, a release from the anger, that I felt a freedom and a release from masturbation and pornography. And in that moment, I thought, man, God has just delivered me from all these strongholds. And in a sense, as I stepped into ministry after that program, I started out as an intern in the church, and I started working there. And I took on a role on the leadership team for the women's ministry. And here I am. God has set me free from these strongholds, and I'm serving. I'm a leader. And I really started to develop this sort of untouchable mentality that I thought, man, God has done all the work, and now it's smooth sailing from here. But I was just so loving building the local church, and God just was so great to bless me to be able to serve the women at the church, and to build this women's ministry. And it was just such a great time of growth and ministry.
Yeah, so you go from this point in your life where everything seemed to defeat you earlier on. I mean,
Mhm.
like you
Mhm.
were always this big failure. You thought
Yeah.
you never had a win. You never had really much of a good day, and then you start to really have success,
Mhm.
so to speak. I mean, you're starting to put some of those things behind you. You're feeling so much better about yourself and who you
Mhm.
are. And Brittany, one of the things that I know happens to all of us, including me, is then you okay. So the one lie is that you're a failure and you never ever gonna amount to anything,
Mhm.
and you can never win. You can never overcome. That's one lie. And then we fall into another lie that says, like, man, I'm really doing pretty good here. And
Yeah.
like I'm super strong now. And so um, that all that failure and potential failure is behind me. And in fact, I can't even imagine myself failing at all now.
Yeah.
Right?
Mhm.
So you
Yeah.
develop what you call untouchables.
It's true. When I was growing so much in the Lord, and I was going in ministry, and I learned all these things that I shouldn't do, right?
Right? Mm-hmm.
You shouldn't have sex outside of marriage, or
Yeah.
get drunk, or steal, or
Right.
you develop these things of what you shouldn't do, and then things of what you should do, like fast and read the Bible and serve and so forth.
Brittany, you've mentioned
Um,
fast a couple times. For my listeners who aren't sure what you mean, like going without food for in a spiritual way, right? For you want
yeah, it's a time that you commit to the Lord, where you're going to give up something, whether that's food,
oh
or I
right,
just did a
sure.
social media
Or
fast.
media, definitely right.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, okay.
Yeah,
So anyway,
just to
I didn't mean to interrupt you there, but
yeah.
yeah. So
No,
you're
that's
talking about
okay.
fasting. So you're talking about all these good things that you're supposed to do: pray, reading the
Uh-huh.
Bible, serving others, going to church,
Yeah, and then you have your list of things you're not supposed to do.
right?
And so I saw it very black and white. I do this and I don't do this, and everything should be good, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so, but what happened was, I just assumed I would never do some of those sins that seem right. Because there are certain sins that we look at and we're like, man, that is so bad. Of course, I will never do that. Of course, I'll never do that. And I would call that our untouchables. They are sins that we just assume that we will never do because they seem so horrible. And that's kind of what I had developed, was this mentality of being untouchable,
Mm.
because I was like, I'm going to do these good things and I'm not going to do these bad things. And I'm in ministry and I'm good to go. I
Yeah.
was untouchable.
So listeners, let me just ask you just to think in your own mind. What are the things that you would say,
Mhm.
I would never do that? And
Mhm.
there would never be a chance for me to do that. I mean, never, ever, ever, ever will I ever do that. What are your untouchables as you're listening to this podcast? So, Brittany, what were some of your untouchables?
Well, certainly I would never have sex outside of
Mm-hmm.
marriage, right? I was going to remain pure until I got married. I would never, steal from somebody. I'll, never hurt somebody. I'll never get drunk, or, those kind
Right.
of typical, have an affair, or those just sins that are, we just assume they're so bad, or,
Sure.
gamble and steal and so
Sure.
forth.
Right.
So, yeah.
Just a reminder, I am Pastor Tom. This is the 24 Today podcast, and you can find me at 24today.org. You can also check me out at tomwhitesel.com. That's TOMWHITESEL.com. I'm on Facebook, 24 Today Facebook, also YouTube. I've got a bunch of interviews like this one. And, my whole thing is that God has taught me to live 24 hours at a time, And so all of my different sites, blogs, interviews, and things that I do are just to try to learn more how to make each day count and to be what God wants us to be within each 24-hour period. And if you want to check me out on those different sites, I invite you to do that. Brittany Rust is my guest. She is an author, incredible writer, speaker, wife, mom, writes for all these great publications. You can find her if you just want to do a Google search of her, Brittany Rust. You can find her on Amazon, with her books. Again, you can find her on Audible if you're an Audible listener. You can check out her website at BrittanyRust.com. That's BRITTANY, Rust, RUST.com. And on there, you can get a free download, 10 steps to get you closer to your dreams. You can find her blog. You can find a really cool thing, I think, for moms, which is called For the Mama Heart. And that's put out every Monday. And Brittany records these vlogs, these little videos that I think are so helpful. Do you want to tell us a little bit about any of that so far, Brittany?
Sure. Yeah. So if you go to my website, you'll find weekly devotionals or articles on the blog. You'll find videos a couple times a month. I'll record a 10 to 15-minute video devotional just about a really important topic to make us, maybe to refine us and to strengthen us as believers. I also have a podcast where we tell people stories of redemption. And then also we have this For the Mama website. You can actually go to forthemamaheart.com, and it's just a place for moms who are weary, who need some encouragement. We have a great team of mom writers who just share really practical topics that moms face. And so I would encourage you to go check out the website.
And again, I am a subscriber to her podcast, and it's called Epic Fails. So just check out Brittany Rust podcast. You'll find it. You can listen to her on there. You've started it relatively, or not too long ago, actually. But it's really good, and you interview people that, such as yourself and all of us, that have really got these stories where they failed and God helped them through that.
Yeah, that was one thing that I was really passionate about. There's great podcasts out there where they're interviewing pastors and well-known people, but I just really wanted to get the everyday mom and business leader and, just the normal person to get their story out there, because I believe there's so much power in our testimony.
Yeah.
And there are so many people out there struggling in silence and struggling alone. And if they hear these podcasts, maybe they'll be like, man, they went through that and look what God did. Maybe he can do the same for me. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Brittany, so we have talked about you were raised in a home that really didn't teach you anything about God. You talked about this very dark times in your life. We've also talked about you coming to the point where you know who God is and experiencing God's grace and things are going so much better. And then you've developed, like we all do, you develop this sense of being untouchable.
Yeah.
Like now, instead of being a failure and you can never ever win, now you kind of get used to winning and you're doing so much better, and you develop these lists of untouchables, things you would never ever do. And one of them was sex outside of marriage. Now, you had started to work, you were involved in ministry in lots of different ways. You're having these great opportunities. But you do say in your book that you were missing companionship in your life.
Yeah. I mean, I was in ministry and had great friends, and I honestly had a really good life. But of course, I was a 25-year-old single girl, and I was starting to miss, I wanted a family. And so when I was 25 and I was serving in leadership at a church, God brought a guy into my life.
God brought a guy into your life.
I do believe that, yes.
It's just interesting because that's a whole nother topic. But God did bring someone into your life. It's wonderful, and yet the very thing that God brought into your life ends up being that something that Satan uses against you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And right? I mean, that's
Yeah, I mean, the Bible says that every good and perfect gift comes from above. So anything good,
yeah.
that we're blessed with, that's from the Lord. Now, then we are asked to be good stewards, right? And this guy and I didn't steward the good thing that we had going on.
So you meet him on
Mm-hmm.
an was it on an Easter Sunday? Is that what
Yeah,
I yeah.
yeah,
In 2010 you meet a gift from God.
yeah.
You meet yeah.
Yeah, I was at work, and after work I had been invited to this Easter luncheon for, adults, single adults who didn't really have anywhere else to go for Easter. And so after I got off work, I was running a little bit late because I had been working, and I went to my friend's house, and I just, assumed I would know everybody there. We all kind of knew each other, in the same circle. And I walked in, and there was one person that I did not know. It was a brand new face to the sort of group in the circle that we were in.
And
Yeah.
everybody, I mean, there was this attraction, right? I mean,
Yeah. Yeah, it was an instant attraction. I saw him immediately across the room. I'm an introvert and he's an extrovert, and he was just, everyone was around him. He was telling the story and people seemed really engaged. And I'm like, "Oh wow, this person, is charming and he's good looking." And I was somebody that I was drawn to, and we actually ended up sitting next to each other
yeah, that's
later
was
on.
that like accident, or did you like plan all that out and somehow end up beside him, or
I actually don't remember how it all worked out. I just remember we ended up sitting next to each other when we were eating, and we started talking about our shared interest in this theologian that we both really liked.
yeah. So
Yeah.
he's a believer,
Yeah.
he's had a change in his life as well, and
Mhm.
so you start to date.
Mhm. We do. Yeah, we took about 4 months of just getting to know each other. We always hung out in this group of friends. It was over the summer, and um about 4 months in, after we had become friends, he um called me up and told me about some of his past struggles, but that he had feelings for me, but he wanted to know what he had gone through before I, said yes to dating him, so to speak. He was
Mm.
someone that had been divorced, and really struggled with, had that, struggle in his past. And he was coming off of that and trying to find a healing, but he wanted me to be very aware of what he had been through. And after that, we took about 2 weeks to just pray and fast. And at the end of the 2 weeks, we got back together, and he said, "Well, would you like to go out with me?" And I was like, "Yes." Yes, I would.
Hmm.
Yeah. So
Now,
that's how it
Brittany,
started.
yeah. So looking back, and we'll talk more about your stories as we go here, and I think listeners are kind of getting an idea of maybe what happened, but looking back now, were there some boundaries that you were already starting to cross? Were there some things that were warning signals and flags, and you were just saying, I'm untouchable, or not?
I'm Yeah, I mean, so initially we came up with some boundaries. Have me having some, just being in ministry, and then him having been married, and we knew that there was probably going to be some temptation there. So we set up some initial boundaries, like we weren't going to kiss for so long, or we weren't going to be in the house, alone together. But we were not very good at sticking to those boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And all of that became pretty apparent. I mean, it became apparent within the first couple months. We just were not super great at, as you'll learn, we just weren't great at holding that boundary.
And you have this deep need for companionship. You
Mhm.
have the struggles that you've had your entire lifetime,
Mhm.
um, and all of that, is feeding into this. Um, Brittany, without going into any unnecessary detail, but what happened now that at this point that actually led you into an untouchable, unthinkable moment?
Sure. So we had been dating a couple of months, and we were at his house. But there was a roommate there, so we thought we were okay. But things got a little too far. It just moved too quickly. And next thing we know, we had sex outside of marriage. And it was certainly nothing we had planned to do. But we just had not been super firm at holding those boundaries. And one night, I did the thing I thought I would never do, right? I said I would never have sex outside of marriage. And within just a short amount of time, I had done the thing I said I would never do.
Well, I just can't imagine how then you felt. I mean,
Yeah.
you've described feeling alone and lost in the dark way before.
Yeah, I feel like this was kind of that first experience after salvation where I felt so just ashamed again. I couldn't believe I had done this thing that I said I would never do. And I did. For a split second, for that brief moment, I was just so stunned that it had happened. And then just instantly, like a flood, those emotions started just overwhelmed me. Those emotions of feeling ashamed and guilty, and how could God ever forgive me? And why would God love me? Why would God ever give me a second chance? I felt that darkness again. And unfortunately, I allowed those emotions to cloud my judgment and my healing experience for a brief amount of time.
Brittany, for my listeners that really are just kind of trying to figure out who God is and aren't even sure about what the Bible is, and I just want to make sure that then you understand that if this happens and you are a leader in ministry, this isn't like another kind of job where you can just go back to work and kind of work out through things privately. I mean, this is a whole nother deal because you're in leadership. Can you kind of explain that a little bit for those who aren't familiar with what that means?
Yeah, so as someone in ministry, you're called biblically to be above reproach. And so by having sex outside of marriage, I had really forfeited the trust that people had put in me to be a spiritual leader. And so, I mean, how could I lead when I had failed, right? And that was one of the that night that it happened. Of course, I thought about how this was going to affect my role at the church, and likely knew that would mean I would lose my job and I would lose all those years of hard work and dreams, invested.
Sure. Brittany, we are going to wrap up this part. This is part one. There's so much more to talk about, and we're just getting started, and you will appreciate hearing the rest of the story. Let me remind you to go to BrittanyRust.com. Remind you to get her book. I've got it, read it, great book. She also has a Bible study called Trust Fall. You can find her all over the place if you search her. She has a blog. She's on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, all over the place. Brittany, we're going to come back here in just a few moments for our second podcast. But again, thank you for being my guest on this first part.
Thank you, Tom.
If this podcast has been helpful for you and you haven't already subscribed, just go to the subscribe button that you'll see on the page and subscribe. That way you'll make sure that you get everything that I put on the podcast the moment that it's available. And if it's helpful for you, it probably would be helpful for someone that you know as well. If you could send them a link or tell them about the podcast, and then also comment on the particular podcast wherever you're at. Rate it, if you will, and that will help others to be able to see and hear about the podcast.